Rachel, you and I were actually on the campaign trail doing a bit of reporting. You went to Mid Bedfordshire. Tell me what the result was there first, and then tell me whether or not you expected it.
So an overwhelming victory for Labour, overturning a Conservative majority of over 24,000. And it was a really interesting race. And I think one of the more interesting seats looking at sort of in general election terms, because this was a three-way race. This was very, very tight between the Conservatives and both Labour and the Liberal Democrats who were challenging. And there aren't that many seats across the country where it isn't obvious who the main rival to the Conservatives are. And that, I think, set the dynamics in play for that seat. Like, no one really knew what was going to happen. There was palpable anger at the Conservatives in general, and specifically at Nadine Dorries. When I went there, people talked about the mess after she kind of said she was going to resign and then she didn't for 10 weeks and wouldn't let a by-election happen. And they were very angry about that, but they were also angry about her performance over the last decade or more. But they were saying, we don't know who to vote for. We don't know whether we should back Labour or the Liberal Democrats. Who can we back to get the Conservatives out? And there was real worry in both of those campaigns that the anti-Tory vote would be split and the Tories would sneak through and win. And they didn't.
So we should explain to our listeners who might have forgotten the context for why this by-election came about. You mentioned Nadine Dorries, and she was a Tory minister and staunch Boris Johnson ally, and she announced her immediate plan.
I would say Boris
Parliament.
Johnson fanatic rather than
fan. So she didn't get a peerage in the former Prime Minister's resignation honours list, and she said that she would resign over that, but then she delayed it until August, which means the contest has actually been sort of artificially running for a long time. I think Labour's campaign has been stationed there since her announcement. And at first, I remember when she announced that she wanted to stand down as an MP, people thought, oh, this is going to be another one of those ones where the Lib Dems leapfrog Labour and Conservatives to come first, because it's one of those semi-rural, I suppose, blue wallish seats. But actually, the narrative changed quite fast and Labour thought they might actually be able to take it. And that's why you had this three-way race rather than in the way that one Labour source described it to be, a non-aggression pact, as has been evident in other by-elections.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Liberal Democrats were the bookies' favourite when she initially announced she was resigning, which was in June. Obviously, as you say, she didn't formally stand down until 10 weeks later. So we had a 10-week shadow by-election campaign where the other parties were raring to go, but it hadn't actually been called yet. The Liberal Democrat argument was that this seat, which is north of London, home counties, very rural. It doesn't have a clear urban centre. It's got a couple of towns. It's got Flitwick. It's got Shefford. It's near Bedford. It's got parts of Bedford, obviously. But it doesn't have a kind of clear urban centre, and it's very rural. And the Liberal Democrats compared it to seats like Somerton and Frome, obviously, which they won over the summer, but also like Chesham and Amersham, a seat that's kind of on the periphery of London. So if you were a London professional at some point, but you wanted to move somewhere greener or have more space, you might end up somewhere like that, with also the rural vote in the villages and people who have voted Conservative for generations. And we should say that Bedfordshire has been a Conservative seat since 1931, like for nearly a century. And they said, the Liberal Democrats said, like, we're the clear party to take this because people will switch to us, but they won't switch to Labour. And I think maybe back in June, they were expecting Labour to sit it out as they did. I know you went down to Somerton and you saw the Liberal Democrat candidate posing with two horses to show that it was a two-horse race.
Yes, exactly.
Labour lost their deposit in that election. They didn't even try. This one was very different. And I think the Liberal Democrats were a bit taken aback by the fact that Labour wanted to fight it really hard. And the campaign literature that I saw, the Liberal Democrats basically said, we are the only party. If you don't want the Tories, vote for us. And the Labour leaflets kind of said the same thing. And I can see why it was like a clear Lib Dem target seat, and they did very well in it as well. We should say, I think the deputy Lib Dem leader is pointing out that if that swing to the Lib Dems was replicated on a national scale, they'd win dozens of seats. But it's a real success story for Labour, winning in a place that you wouldn't expect Labour to ever be able to win. And I spoke to their candidate now, the MP, Alistair Strathern there, and he was saying that they have seen people who were lifelong Conservative voters switching to Labour, not staying home, which is what the Conservative narrative is, people stayed home, not switching to the Lib Dems as a kind of protest vote, but actively switching from Tory to Labour because they are so fed up with Nadine Dorries and with the Conservatives at the moment. And that, I think, is a really crucial bit of election insight.
Did you think that was the reason why Labour won? That the switching, or what else was it that made them win in a seat that they've never won before, with a demographic that you wouldn't necessarily associate with Labour?
I think two things. One, the anger at Nadine Dorries. I got some great quotes about her from enraged locals. As much use as a chocolate fireplace was my favourite. People saying that they just never seen her. They felt taken for granted. She didn't hold constituency surgeries. Huge focus in this by-election on local issues. All three of the candidates were bigging up their local credentials and accusing each other of not being local enough. There was a big emphasis on GP provision and healthcare provision and the fact that they've got one of the fewest number of doctors per people in the constituency.
Yeah.
And obviously the cost of living crisis being a really big one as well, because even though it's considered a really affluent area, very high proportion own their homes with mortgages, and obviously interest rates have an impact there. So real anger at Nadine Dorries and just like wanting to, as one voter put it to me, stick two fingers up. But the demographics point is also interesting, I think, because it's one of those seats that is on the periphery of several cities. So you've got London, it's also close to Cambridge, it's close to Milton Keynes. And I think it speaks to a trend of young people who work in those urban centres being priced out of London. Cambridge is one of the most expensive parts of the country as well, and being pushed into the outskirts, areas that were true blue, but they can't get houses in the urban centres because you haven't built anything for a decade and a half. And so that's having an impact as well. So a lot of young people, a lot of new housing development, a lot of anger on the fact that the new housing development hasn't been matched with new facilities and provisions, GP, school places, that kind of thing. But I think it does come down to the housing crisis in a way as well, because if we had built more homes for young people in cities, they would be forced out. And the failure to do that is actually damaging the Conservatives in their heartlands, because their heartlands are now full of young people who can't afford to live in the urban centres.
That's really interesting, because you might have thought that Keir Starmer's comments that he would ignore opposition to bulldozing through planning regulations, I think is how he put it, might be off-putting to voters in seats like Mid Bedfordshire. You saw what happened in Chesham and Amersham. It was seen widely as a sort of referendum on Boris Johnson's, planning reforms that was supposed to radically shake up the system.
Yeah, exactly. So when I heard Keir Starmer make that announcement at Labour Party conference, it was a few days after I'd visited the constituency, and I thought, oh, this is really risky for exactly that reason, because people did talk about development and too many new people without enough provisions for actually them living there. Yeah. There's this new town, Wixham's, that started being built in 2007. About 5,000 people live there now. They were promised a GP surgery. It hasn't happened. You've got 5,000 people who have to drive a 12-mile round trip to see a doctor, that kind of thing. So I did think that was a risk when he put that so strongly, that he was in favour of it and would go forward with new developments. But at the same time, the people on the doorstep, they weren't necessarily worried about the new housing. They were worried about the fact that it hadn't been matched with any of the infrastructure that you need for new housing. And they were really worried about housing costs as well for their children and their families, and local people being priced out of the area as well. So I think that message that seemed a bit high risk when he said it, there is clearly a demographic of the electorate that hears that and goes, good, that's what we need.
What do you think it says about the relationship between Labour and Lib Dems, and the sort of opportunities for those sort of quiet, informal, okay, you take this one and we'll take that one kind of scenarios in future, both by-elections and the general election?
It got pretty bitter, I would say. I mean, but both the candidates that I spoke to were absolutely lovely and gracious and polite and civil about one another. But I think the campaign literature wasn't. And was very stark in the message it was trying to convey. And both candidates said that if the result went the other way and the Tories were able to to get ahead because the vote had been split, they'd be absolutely devastated by that, but not devastated enough to stand aside. So I think there is bitterness there. And I think on the Lib Dem side, they probably think that if Labour had backed down very clearly, that would be their seats. There aren't, as I said, there aren't that many seats where that kind of thing is applicable. Usually it's very clear who the challenger is, but I don't think there's a lot of warm, cuddly feelings between Labour and the Lib Dems at the moment.
Well, I think in a way it's helpful for them because they're often being accused of stitching things up by the Tories. And so it's helpful to sort of say, well, no, we didn't make a pact. Look, clearly we were, fighting tooth and nail for this seat against one another. So perhaps, in terms of optics at least, it's helpful.
It's really interesting, I think, that somewhere that was such a safe Conservative seat that wouldn't even have been on the target list for Labour in a general election has turned. And if we think about all of the focus that we poured into the Conservatives clinging on to Uxbridge and South Ruislip by less than 500 votes, and Labour's majority now is more than double that, there's a story there.
Yeah, and it's again not a hold as well. You know, Uxbridge and South Ruislip wasn't lost by Labour.
No, it was clung onto, and yet the narrative somehow was that Labour had failed, which is another thing to think about, which is that we look at the Labour swing in the polls, that's not evenly distributed across the country. And so there are places like Mid Bedfordshire and like Tamworth where the swing looks like it's greater than the polls are showing, which if I were a Conservative strategist would make me very worried indeed.
Yeah, and talking of Tamworth, let's move on to this result. So this by-election was triggered by the resignation of another Conservative MP, Chris Pincher, after his appeal against a House of Commons suspension for alleged groping was rejected. And so he also hasn't been a presence in the constituency for a very long time since those allegations first came out. And since the scandal broke, he's been keeping this low profile. And that's something that actually on the Conservative campaign, they made a point to me. We've hardly had a visible Tory MP here for a while. They were trying to paint it in a way that, that's a strength because our candidate can differentiate himself from him and say, I'm a local champion. He grew up there in a council estate, and they were trying to say how much he understood local issues because he was a councillor and things. So they were trying to make a virtue of it. But, I think it was a bit of a desperate effort.
Am I right that he didn't even put Conservative on his campaign literature?
Yeah, the leaflets, and this is common, I think, in by-elections now, but the leaflets really didn't, Conservatives is in a tiny, tiny thing, and often they're not even blue, the leaflets. They don't sort of betray the party. It's more about the person on the leaflet. My impressions from this seat. So obviously Labour won it. I'm sure our listeners will have seen the results. It was a slim majority, but it was a big Conservative majority that they were taking on, nearly 20,000. And this is a constituency that was once a bellwether. So it was actually won by Labour off the Conservatives in a by-election in 96, so before a general election year. And they managed to hold it during the landslide that followed. And then it switched back to Tory in 2010. So it was seen as a bellwether. But since 2010, Tories have been getting increasing majorities, so over 10,000 majorities from 2015 onwards, in a region that is trending Tory faster than the average.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that because the Midlands has become this centre of Tory sentiment and has been the swing to the Conservatives there over the last decade has been stronger than elsewhere in the country. It's also a really Leave voting seat, right? So
very Leave voting, 66% for Leave. And it's in a region, so the Midlands, both the West and East Midlands have been becoming, it's probably the sort of new Tory stronghold. A big proportion of Conservative MPs have their seats in this area. All 12 Staffordshire MPs, which is the county where Tamworth is, are Conservative or were Conservative. Now there is a Labour MP there. And it's, pollsters have been really interested in this area because generally in the political commentariat, we're obsessed with the north-south divide. Red Wall people generally see as north, even though the Red Wall seats actually technically include Midlands seats. It's just people always forget that. And Blue Wall, people are obsessed with that. But actually a polling expert at the think tank Onward explained to me that this is something called the compass fallacy, where we're fixated on north, south, east and west, but we forget what's in the middle. And actually the middle is very key to Tory success. And so it's interesting that Labour managed to overturn that trend because that's a long-term trend. That's been trending since the Second World War. That's not something that's just been, it has been exacerbated by Brexit, but it's not something that's just a newer trend. And so it's interesting that Labour can still win in these kind of areas. It's not really a bellwether anymore. So maybe it's gone back to being a bellwether now.
But the Brexit thing is also interesting if you overlay that on top of it, because after 2019, there was the consensus that Brexit had kind of fundamentally redrawn the electoral map, and that Leave versus Remain was one of the key indicators as how somewhere would vote. And then even as recently as 2021, Labour were doing really badly in Brexit voting areas.
Yep.
And within 2 years, it looks like that trend has been stalled or even reversed.
Well, yes, exactly. And it didn't come up. So I was following Labour campaigners on the doorstep. The Tory campaign didn't let me go out with them, and in fact didn't let me speak to their candidate.
Tory campaign didn't let me speak to them.
Yeah. I mean, this is actually, can we just do an aside on this? I want to do a pious rant about this. This is not the first by-election in the past few years where I have gone up to the Conservative candidate and politely asked them about how the campaign was going, just for a few questions, to make it fair. You know, you want to speak to every side. And they've completely ignored me and walked away. I remember one in a previous by-election, I think it was in Wakefield, actually jumped in his car and drove away. This guy, Andrew Cooper, who was the Conservative candidate, who, let's not forget, has served in Kosovo and Iraq, couldn't face me.
You're very intimidating, Anoosh.
And just went into a private meeting room, wouldn't speak to me. I'm fed up with this. I do think that it's bad for democracy. You saw him as well at the count when the Labour candidate, now the MP, was making her victory speech. He just walked out the door, out of a fire exit, and went out. I just think it's ungracious. You know, this is democracy. You've put yourself forward. You know, hopefully you think you've fought the best fight that you can, and it's electoral politics, unfortunately, that are getting in your way. Anyway, I do find it really tiresome. So anyone at CCHQ, if you're listening, we will give you a hearing. You know, we want to be fair. We want to hear what your candidates have to say. And so do their constituents or potential constituents. But in terms of what we were saying about Tamworth, Brexit didn't come up on the doorstep at all. What people were mentioning, actually Chris Pincher as well, the issue with the MP who resigned in scandal, that didn't really come up either. And actually the Labour campaign sort of privately conceded to me that it wasn't like a huge thing that they were hearing from voters. It was a bit of that behaviour, but it was more the general behaviour of the Conservatives in government, mainly partygate and the mini budget. And I think as journalists, and I've said this before, we move very fast. You know, we think Partygate was a long time ago, but voters don't forget things so quickly. And I heard Greg Hands, the Conservative Party chair, on the radio this morning being asked about the Jingle and Mingle party. And he was saying, you're asking me about something that happened 3 years ago. Well, in voters' minds, it's important because, you know, it was unjust what happened. And the pandemic was one of the hugest things that has happened in our lives. And people haven't forgotten about it.
And this is the first opportunity they've had to make their voices heard on that. So even though, you know, politically Westminster might have moved on, they haven't had that opportunity yet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly, I think, one of the issues here. And then, of course, local services were mentioned, a bit like you were talking about the GP appointments. The stripping of the services at the local hospital, water companies and the sewage and the water came up too, and cost of living, and the fact that, you know, people weren't able to sell their houses or their mortgages have gone up, came up a lot. So it's all of those sort of classic issues. And I'm personally am not surprised that Labour won this by-election because the campaign did seem quite confident in the week that I visited before the vote.
One question that I would have is how much did other issues other than Brexit, things like immigration and culture war things, come up? Because one thing that I've seen this morning has been, obviously, Reform didn't do, the sort of further right party didn't do very well in either of them, but it did get more votes than the Labour majorities. So I've already seen MPs like the Conservative MP John Redwood say, yes, what we need to do is to go more right-wing, harder on immigration, harder on culture war things, and to be a sort of a true right-wing party, and that's how we'll win. I didn't get any sense of that from Mid Bedfordshire at all. I wondered if you got any sense of that from Tamworth.
I didn't personally from voters, but it clearly was an issue because on Labour's leaflets, quite high up was, we will close the asylum hotels, because there is a hotel that's housing asylum seekers in that area, which has been sort of locally controversial. So it did feature, I think, in the sort of local debate. And let's not forget, it's a high Brexit voting area. So there will be that scepticism towards immigration there. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.